Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those of you on, I don't know what time zone would be afternoon. We're here in Geneva, and I'm Zaina El-Saman. I'm the I lead the humanitarian work at Grand Challenges Canada. And I'm happy to be here in Geneva, and thank you to those who are joining us here in person and those joining us online. I think we'll get started. We've got a range of speakers and sort of contributions today, both in person and online. It's a very much a hybrid session today for many reasons, but also sort of latest travel restrictions and complications have made it difficult for folks to sort of be here in Geneva with us. So we're kind of rolling with it in a very hybrid format. Maybe I'll get us started. So access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy remains one of the most pressing challenges in humanitarian settings, where over 123 million people are displaced due to conflict, persecution, and environmental crises. Now, despite energy being a critical enabler for health, education, livelihoods, and safety, an estimated 94% of displaced people in camps lack access to electricity, and 84% lack access to clean cooking, relying instead on costly and environmentally damaging sources such as diesel and biomass. So for those humanitarians in the room, I think this problem is a problem we all know too well. And yet, despite sort of growing attention and some level of sort of more targeted interest and projects in clean energy investment, the overall electrification gap remains very large, and progress has not yet translated into major increases in the proportion of displaced people with reliable access to electricity or even clean energy solutions more broadly. Now, there are a range of issues contributing to this problem, of course. The humanitarian energy sector remains heavily dependent on short-term and grant-based funding. Which is often short-lived, too short-lived to make meaningful progress. Humanitarian operations remain underfunded. And of course, catastrophic funding crises of 2025, which we're all still very much navigating as a sector, only exacerbated the existing problem. Rigid budget cycles as well limit long-term energy investment and ongoing maintenance costs. Private capital, with all of its promise and potential, often falls short at addressing the needs of the most vulnerable last mile users and distributors and energy distributors, only deepening the electrification gap further, often because fragile markets are perceived as too risky and commercially unattractive. So humanitarian discourse, and for those of you who perhaps were in London last week at the Humanitarian Finance Summit, I think what we heard loud and clear, blended and innovative finance is sort of this big interest for the sector. And so the discourse in the sector, in the humanitarian space, is really pointing towards these mechanisms, let's say, to solve our woes. However, the evidence is skim on how well these mechanisms support last mile energy distributors and ultimately last mile users, as they typically focus on large multinational companies rather than smaller, more local enterprises who are often at the front lines of serving the lowest income and displaced populations. So last year, our friends at Innovation Norway and the Global Platform for Action for Sustainable Energy Development partnered with a small team of researchers and practitioners to commission a paper that examines the points of failures and past learning in clean energy investment in fragile markets. And this really prompted Grand Challenges Canada to further build on the evidence base, also in partnership with the same group of researchers and practitioners. And what we ended up doing was we commissioned a study to better understand and try to solve for the barriers specifically for last mile energy distributors in accessing private capital and scaling community-driven and innovative clean energy solutions. So today we have here with us Dr. Tash Peros, who is both an independent consultant and a senior research fellow at University College London. And she's going to provide us with a readout of the preliminary findings that have been emerging from this paper. with hopes to spark some discussion and collective action in the sector to design financing tools that can truly de-risk investment for last-mile energy distributors, crowd in private capital, and build resilience of these developers to promote more inclusive and sustainable energy access in fragile contexts. So from there, we're going to move into a couple of lightning talks to energize us and showcase some bold solutions in the clean energy innovation space. And then after the lightning talks, we're going to be joined by speakers online as well as speakers here in person for a bit of a panel discussion that will really bring together energy practitioners, funders, and researchers to share other emerging market insights that can help shape how we are thinking about the future of clean energy investment in fragile settings. So enough from me. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to turn the mic over to Tash Peros, who's going to walk us through the energy paper that GCC Grand Challenges Canada has commissioned and sort of some of the emerging findings. And what we'll do is we'll leave time at the end if there's any questions or reflections more broadly. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Tash.
Thank you very much, Zaina. Can everyone see and hear me okay? Yeah, okay, cool. So as Zaina said, my name is Tash, and I'm here to present a piece of research that I've been working on for the past 6 months or so, along with my colleagues, Paul, who I believe might have joined us online, and Nazifa Rafa. And it's about aggregator funds and the role that they could play in extending access to energy in humanitarian settings. Do you want to go to the next slide, please, Zaina, so you can see the title? Thank you. Yeah, so over the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to walk you through this paper and talk to you about what we've done and what we've found. Next slide, please. So I'm sure that all of us here are all too aware about the exceptionally challenging circumstances that are faced by the humanitarian sector at the moment. The funding that's available is declining, whilst the size of the funding that's needed is increasing. And this is driving a need to shift towards market-based solutions and innovative finance, as Zaina called them, mechanisms to solve our woes. And in theory, there's a good amount of funding available through these innovative sources of finance, stuff like carbon credits, IREX, adaptation finance, PPAs. But the reality is that it's extremely hard to access, especially for smaller organizations. And this is what kind of this is the background that drove us to do our research and to choose aggregator funds as the topic that we focused on. So we wanted to examine the role of aggregator funds in advancing energy access in humanitarian energy settings. And there were 3 key questions that we focused on within that. So firstly, we wanted to understand the common barriers and enablers to small organizations accessing innovative finance. Secondly, we wanted to understand how aggregator funds can be designed to effectively address these barriers for both funders and for the MSMEs. And then lastly, we wanted to understand what the opportunities are for scaling up and replicating aggregator models in these settings. Next slide, please. So what exactly do I mean by an aggregator fund? There are some arrows missing off this slide for some reason. But basically the idea is that an aggregator fund draws in sources of finance from multiple different partners. So they might be using debt, outcome-based finance like carbon or IREX or PREX, first loss capital. It pulls all of these different sources of finance together and it distributes them to smaller companies that otherwise might struggle to access them. So in this way, an aggregator fund acts as a vehicle to bundle smaller, riskier transactions, enabling economies of scale, risk diversification, and improved access to finance for energy distributors operating in humanitarian settings. Next slide, please. So our project looked at aggregator funds via the following methodology. We started off with some scoping interviews. We wanted to understand within the topics of innovative finance, humanitarian energy, where was the research gap we could find that would be useful and additional to what already exists out there, which is what led us to this idea of aggregator funds. The next phase of the research explored barriers that already exist for MSMEs to access innovative finance. And we did this in 2 different ways. So Mercy Corps hosted a workshop in Uganda in, I think, October. They brought together 30 different MSMEs to talk about the barriers that they face in kind of scaling up their operations and accessing finance to do the great stuff that they do. And then on top of that, we had interviews with 12 different ecosystem actors, potentially a slightly small number, but I think it reflects the fact that this is a very novel topic, and there just weren't that many people we could speak to. Finally, we did 2 case studies. So we focused on the REP fund and the PREC aggregator facility, and that involved more interviews and reviews of internal documentation to understand how they worked and what they're doing. Next slide, please. So my next few slides are going to present the results of the scoping, the first phase of the research, so the interviews with ecosystem actors and the workshop that we attended in Uganda. And just to sort of share some of the headline findings with you. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the broad challenges with funding in humanitarian energy. So I think that this will be familiar content for many of you attending, but funding is fragmented, it's uncoordinated, and it's politicized. And this forces companies into cycles of grant chasing. And that is harmful because there are really mismatched timescales here for people to do what they need to do. So infrastructure takes 5 to 10 years to develop, but when grants have time horizons of 12 months, it becomes really difficult to plan and to finance these projects. And then the final one that emerged was the constraints of the UN system. So procurement is too long for private partners. The UN is seen as an unreliable customer for PPAs due to the agency's own funding volatility and short planning cycles, as we've already discussed. Next slide, please. So on top of those barriers, which are kind of faced by all of the private sector, the smaller organizations, the MSMEs, face further structural exclusion. So the first kind of issue that emerged is that there's a complete scale mismatch, which I tried to represent by showing a very small shoe and a very large foot. So the volume requirements for buyers of instruments like carbon credits and IRACs is just too high. A single project can't produce enough to make a buyer interested. And on top of that, you have the issue that minimum tickets of institutional investors are too large. There's a real lack of small ticket financing, and what was meant by that was sort of tickets of $250,000 or under. The next structural barrier was around due diligence requirements. So, typically kind of large investors have very complex systems. They want to really be sure about where their money is going, that it's being placed in the hands of people who know how to manage it. But that in turn creates administrative barriers that can exclude smaller organizations. And we found that MSMEs can lack the financial management and government systems that are required to pass due diligence requirements. And then finally, the research unveiled the need for patient capital and specialist instruments. So I guess with a lot of energy projects, you have a problem in that you need to purchase inventory. After purchasing it, which you need a lot of money for, you then need to distribute it. And it's maybe after that point where you start to see revenues flowing, so you have a lag. So there's a pervasive need to access basic patient capital to purchase inventory and to fulfill existing demand, which is not reflected in current instruments available, which is mostly debt, where the interest starts immediately as soon as you've taken out the loan. Next slide, please. And then, finally, we identified some key features of aggregator funds to make them MSME friendly. So aggregator funds need to be nationally relevant but global connected, so they need to combine local embeddedness and partnerships with access to international capital. They need to be flexible and adaptable, given the volatility of the contexts that people are operating in. They need to provide technical assistance to help companies pass due diligence requirements and also improve their business operations. And the specific topics that were revealed were financial management, sales strategy, and business planning. And then, there's lastly a point around accessibility. So the application process for accessing finance needs to be kind of simple enough for the small guys to be able to do it. And the due diligence requirements need to be manageable and realistic too. Next slide, please. I'm going to jump now to talking about some of the 2 case studies that we did. So the first one is the PREC aggregator facility, and I'm going to start by just trying to very quickly explain how a PREC works. So a PREC is a Peace Renewable Energy Credit. And here's the basic idea. So you have a project, usually a solar or a hydro mini grid, which is generating some electricity. That electricity has 2 purposes. So it is used by end users, but then also it's used to generate PRECs for voluntary markets. Those PRECs can be sold to corporate buyers, and that generates revenue that then goes back to the project developer. But there are a number of steps along this process that are really prohibitive to MSMEs. Next slide, please. Yeah, so they are highlighted here. So like, firstly, it's really difficult to set up a project. That sounds like an obvious point, but financing infrastructure is really challenging at the moment. So getting to the point of being able to generate electricity is super hard. Once you are generating electricity, in order to generate PRECs that are sold to the voluntary market, you need to set up a PREC project that involves a certification project process, which you need to have a certain level of knowledge and familiarity to do. Plus, there are kind of lead times and expenses incurred in doing so. Once you're generating your PRECs, you then need to be able to sell them to someone, and you need to actively find a buyer. So it requires networks and other places to find people that are willing to buy these credits. Next slide, please. So the PREC aggregation facility seeks to solve some of these barriers as follows. I know this is quite a complicated diagram, but I'll just try and talk you through it very quickly. So the PREC aggregation facility, or PAF, is drawing together sources of finance from many different players, so impact investors, DFIs, and corporates. That money goes to PAF. PAF takes that money and it gives it to project developers in the form of an upfront payment. And that upfront payment is purposefully designed to be worth about 10% of the capex required to get the project off the ground. So it's catalytic capital that's supposed to allow developers to then sort of use it to go and raise other funding to make the project happen. The project then gets built and it's generating electricity. The rights to the PRECs then go back to the PREC aggregation facility. PAF then it bundles that up with lots of other developers doing similar things, and it gets those PRECs certified and issued through Energy Peace Partners, who are the organization that developed the PREC. PAF then takes the PRECs that are generated through multiple projects, it sells them to PREC buyers and brokers, corporates usually, who are using them for CSR purposes. That money goes back into the PREC aggregation fund, and ultimately it goes back to repay the investors. Next slide, please. So that's kind of roughly how PAF works. So it's trying to address some of those triangular warning signs that I showed you on a couple of slides back. So where it's at the moment, there's an $11 million pilot launching this year, which was developed with help from various finance accelerators. As I said, it's providing up to 10% capex for small-scale mini-grids. The investor profits are capped at 6% per year, and any additional profits are reinvested into new projects, which are registered as a non-profit. So the opportunities here are that it's a credible investor-friendly intermediary that facilitates transactions. That credibility comes partly from the fact that it's got a kind of a fund manager who are very experienced in this sector and bring a track record, so that's Camco, but it's also spreading risk of PRECs amongst multiple developers and locations. It's able to aggregate large volumes of PRECs, which enables sales to larger corporates that wouldn't be able to buy from a project individually. It saves individual projects the need for certification, and it's providing that catalytic capital to help build infrastructure. PAF has also faced some challenges in getting to where it is. So struggled to fundraise. So the phrase "come back when it's a $50 million facility" was bandied around. It's difficult, I think, to raise finance to pilot things, right? Which is needed to get to the point where you're a $50 million facility. And there's quite a lot of risk involved. So the project developers need to find that remaining 90% capex. We know that there's not much money around at the moment, so there's a risk of the capital not being deployed. And then once it is deployed, PAF is making a big bet on future sales of PRECs. So if for some reason that doesn't happen, like maybe there's a conflict, maybe there's a company goes under, and those PRECs are not generated for 10 years as forecast, then that can harm the performance of the whole fund. Next slide, please. Carbon credits. So I'm now going to talk about the next case study, which was the REP fund. I don't have a whole lot of time, but basically we see here a very similar pathway to generating carbon credits as with the PRECs. There's a project. That project needs to finance inventory to hand out, in this case, cook stoves and to plant trees. That results in emissions reductions. It also generates energy for end users. Then if you are able to set up a carbon project, which can cost, a few $100,000, you can issue carbon credits for voluntary or compliance markets. Selling them allows you to create revenue, and that can go back into the project. Next slide, please. Oh, we're missing some arrows again. But REP functions in a slightly different way. So under the REP fund, that whole process of kind of accrediting and selling carbon credits still sits with the project developer. What's different is that the REP fund, which is held by UNHCR, provides the project developers with the permission to operate in camps. It also gives them a repayable grant at the beginning of the project, which allows them to sort of set the project up and buy the inventory that they need to. And then the revenue that the projects generate from selling carbon credits then goes back into the REP fund, again, to repay the investors or to replenish the money that has been spent on project developers. Next slide, please. So REP is a bit bigger than PAF, so it's going to be a $30 million blended vehicle. There will be pilots launching in Uganda and Rwanda in 2026. It will be issuing repayable grants of $1.5 million to the consortia that it picks to run projects. And it's targeting an internal rate of return of 20%, with all the money returning to a revolving fund for future projects. So some of the opportunities here is that REP will be generating very high quality carbon credits with large quotas about carbon revenues being shared back with the community and very high co-benefits, which are inherent to the locations in which it's operating. It's sparked procurement innovation within UNHCR, and it plans to eventually shift to outside the UN, and this would allow the credits to be aggregated and bundled in a similar way to the PAF currently is not able to happen. There have also been a number of challenges, so some extremely delayed setup processes, which is due to the complexity of working with multiple parties. Cultural barriers within the UN, so apparently internal rate of return was like speaking Mandarin, a concept that is not particularly familiar in that environment, procurement systems that are unfit for purpose for contracting the private sector on these sorts of projects. REP is unable to hold carbon credits. There are some inherent risks in carbon credits, which I won't go into, to do with the voluntary carbon market. A big one is reputational risk with benefit sharing. So the UN's mandate is protection, and if the projects involved in the REP fund do not adequately protect people or kind of share revenues appropriately, then that could harm the reputation of the agency. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of finish up with some overall observations about all of this research that we've done together. So we conclude that aggregator funds do offer cause for cautious optimism. There are some really important opportunities here. So aggregator funds could provide sustainable long-term funding, bridging gaps between international markets and MSMEs. They also offer segues for global North-based financial institutions and corporate buyers to participate in the humanitarian space. And I think bridging these gaps is always a step towards kind of increased knowledge and sort of buy-in to trying to address them, right? Only good things can come from that. It provides an opportunity to debunk myths about the bankability of humanitarian energy projects. Like if these initiatives work, if indeed they do manage to produce modest returns for investors, I think that will be a real win for the sector. And then finally, we have some really exciting initiatives coming through. I've talked about REP and PAF, but there are also others like Mercy Corps' Humanergy facility. We also have some challenges, so they remain unproven. We're at a point now where there are several laws starting at once. They are constrained by the institutional environments they seek to navigate. So, for example, going back to the REP fund and the kind of challenges of setting that up within the constraints and the norms of the UN system, wider ecosystem change is needed to allow them to flourish. A really important point is that they will only work in specific settings and contexts. So both of these initiatives, REP and PAF, they are purposefully picking projects and locations that are likely to succeed, right? So there are lots of settings, lots of populations for whom market-based solutions simply will not work, and we need to not forget that. And then my final point is just a reflection that we need to be a little bit careful with the commoditization of conflict and poverty. So there was a paper written about the REP fund actually that questioned the moral standings of a fund that's exploiting the already precarious conditions of refugees, and highlights a risk of keeping them trapped in displacement whilst greening operations. I think that's maybe a bit of an exaggerated risk, but I do think it's still something that we need to think carefully about. Thank you very much, Zaina. Sorry for slightly overrunning.
No worries. Thank you, Tash, for walking us through some very complex topics, but somehow managing to make it sound so comprehensive and easy to digest. So really, we're really looking forward to the launch of the paper. So it hasn't been published yet. Tash's team is working on it currently. So those are very much, sort of hot off the press or before it reaches the press, perhaps, emergent findings. And we'll be launching a policy brief that sort of captures the sort of key findings for practitioners from that paper. It's currently in progress. And then Tash's team is also working with us to publish this report in a peer-reviewed academic journal, which we hope to have published later this year. So we're really looking forward to sort of the final findings and the final paper, but I think you've captured some really interesting findings and opportunities and challenges that we have we have upon us as a sector. We think about the role of sort of innovative finance and new financial instruments and mechanisms that can really support more clean energy investment in the humanitarian space, in particular supporting local energy distributors to access more capital, more, with better terms and more accessible capital. So from here, I'm going to move on, and we'll have a chance to talk to Tash in a bit for the panel segment, but just to kind of shake things up and energize us a bit with some solutions that are out there. They're doing some great work. We're going to hear from Nora Stirrer from the REC Coalition, who's going to walk us through some of the work that they have underway on this theme of sort of clean energy and opportunities. So Nora, I'm going to pass the mic over to you.
Thanks so much. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah, you can go straight to the next slide there. Thank you. So I would like to just give you a little overview over financing solarization, who's doing what, some key figures. Maybe a couple of disclaimers. We really try to work closely with the field. So what we've done here is really try to distill some relatively, I hope, clear and simple messages. So, following the very sophisticated talk of Tash, you'll find maybe some comparatively simple messages here. And maybe just a few words about who we are. For those of you who don't know us, the REC Coalition, we refer to ourselves as the Logistics Cluster Environmental Sustainability Team. We're a small team. We're here to help the humanitarian community embrace the do no harm principle by including sustainability in their operations, in their supply chain operations. We have a supply chain focus. And among the many services we offer, we have a help desk. So I'm saying that because if you or any of your partners need assistance with it, when it comes to sustainability, that means energy, but it can also mean many other topics such as procurement, you can reach out to us, and our service is free. I'm going to put the email address in the chat after the presentation, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Without further ado, if you want to move to not to the next one, but to the one after that, perfect. Thank you so much. So we already heard it, but just, in a nutshell, why should we care about solarization? Well, several reasons, and I'm actually not going to start with decarbonization or emissions. I'm going to start with cost efficiency. A figure from the Global Platform for Action is that just 6 UN organizations plus ICRC, I think it is, spend over 108 million a year, US dollars a year, on generator fuel. Some estimates speak of 5% of budget, but I've heard cases like, for example, the IOM for their humanitarian hubs in northern Nigeria. They spent, before solarization, they spent over 50% of their operational budget on generator fuel. So there is really a cost factor here that's, I would say, and I'm coming from a sustainability lens here, right, as important in the realities of humanitarian organizations as the emissions factor. There's also the business continuity and security. Transporting generator fuel carries a risk with attacks, with disruptions in infrastructure. We have many cases here. There, for example, a warehouse in Kenya and Dadaab they were able to remain operational during a flooding because they were solarized, and others around them actually were no longer operational. There are cases of Médecins du Monde, Doctors of the World in Colombia, who switched to mobile solar units because it was more secure for them. They were less likely to get attacked moving around the country. So this, again, is a really important point. So, and we see a lot of our partners, they're considering solarization because of those two things, and then also because of emissions, right? And then obviously there is decarbonization. So if you move to the next slide. Thanks. So obviously emissions and decarbonization is important. The humanitarian sector is responsible for the emissions the same scale as around the national health system in the UK. So apologies for that European comparison, or a large European city. So it is significant. Most of that is in supply chain, and most of that is in procurement, actually, not in energy, but that doesn't mean that energy isn't important. It is, of course. And when we look at warehouses, for example, we see that over 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions in a warehouse are attributable to generators, if they're fueled by generators. So again, despite my previous points, emissions and decarbonization remain extremely important. If you go to the next slide. Okay, so what we find in our overview, and I should maybe just say a few words about the figures here, we consider 24 humanitarian organizations. So this means we do hope this gives some insight, but it is not entirely comprehensive. Of course, there are way more humanitarian organizations out there that we were not able to consider. What we've done here, we've considered a mix of survey responses and desk research, but we didn't have data for all data points that I will be speaking about. So, for example, some organizations that responded, they had a figure on the upfront investment, but they did not have a figure, for example, for what they had spent on generator fuel before solarization. So take what I say with a grain of sand. When you analyze, your own cost structure, you will of course always need to take into account the size of your own system situation, cost of fuel, and so on and so on. Okay, but what we find is that on average, solarization covers around 50% of annual energy demand. It can vary. We certainly have cases like in Sudan or in Afghanistan, where the Save the Children International / English Refugee Council for Afghanistan, we're able to cover 100% of energy demand, which is fantastic. But we also have cases, for example, in Bangladesh, concern worldwide, where I think it was more in the range of 14%. So it varies, right? But the amount spent on generator fuel consumption prior to solarization, you can see here, is very significant. And we find that most respondents spend well over 5,000 a year, and it can actually go way higher than that. It can go well beyond 10,000 US dollars per year. Why is this important? Well, it's important because that spending actually can come close to what you need to invest upfront to solarize. Again, it depends on how much energy demand you're able to cover, and the size, and so on and so on. But I want to re-emphasize the point that Tash also made. The financing problem that we have is very much one of budget cycles, which, as Tash said, is short-term, and we need to overcome that. The financial figures themselves speak a pretty clear language that does make financial sense. If you go to the next slide. So some key insights to emphasize what I have just said. So conservatively, what we find, and again with a grain of salt, that does not consider each and every humanitarian organization out there, we do find that net savings can be realized of over 70,000 US dollars over a 10-year lifespan. This is assuming an upfront investment of 30,000 US dollars. So it can be more or less, of course, and a payback time of 4 years. It can be more or less, but these are some average figures that we're finding. And it's assuming that solar equipment lasts above more than 10 years, which, for panels, it can be more. It's significantly more. For inverters, it can be less. But this gives you, I think, a conservative estimate. So again, it is important, but you need to adopt this total cost of ownership perspective and the multi-year perspective. Without that, it will be very difficult to make the financial case. Not very difficult, but it can be tricky. As I said, upfront investment can be close to annual energy spending on generator fuel, but you need to spend the time to do that analysis, and you need to involve closely your procurement, your budget teams, because it may require, if you can, and it can be very tricky, moving beyond the annual or very short-term budget cycle thinking. Payback times we find is 3 to 5 years, so it really isn't very long. It can be much shorter than that. The Afghanistan case I spoke to you earlier, they have a payback time of 17 months, 17, so it's really quite short. And we do find that some upfront investment, some ways to overcome upfront investment really are underutilized. And again, that comes to Tasha's point earlier. If you go to the next slide. Thank you. So upfront investment, again, what we find based on the desk research and the survey responses, you can see it here, typically between 10,000 and 50,000 US dollars. Again, it depends very much on the size. It can be less than that. It can be a bit more than that. But the point is, must not, but can come close to what you've spent on generator fuel before that. If you move to the next slide. And realized savings, again, like most respondents indicated, it was above 10,000 US dollars. It can be less, as you can see here, but again, the financial figures really are quite clear, because if this is what your upfront finance is, or if it's a little bit more, chances are you will make back your upfront finance very quickly. And then, of course, it comes to the payback times. If you go to the next slide, that I have already mentioned to you, which is around 3 to 5 years. It can be a bit more, but often we also have cases where it is significantly less, as I've just told you about the Afghanistan case, right? So it really depends, obviously, on the cost structure and so on and so on. But the point is that financially speaking, if you don't, if you don't consider for a moment the problem of budget cycles and of grant chasing and so on, financially speaking, it just really makes sense. If you go to the next slide, and that's, I think, will be my final one. Yeah, so we do really see that new, and again, to Tasha's point, new financial models are extremely important in times of tight budget, but they are underutilized. So most of what we have found is that organizations still use, let's say, classic funding. So, they ask headquarters for covering part or the whole of the upfront finance, or a specific donor funding for it, specific funding envelopes, or designated internal funding programs. There's nothing wrong with that per se, and it is extremely important for donors to embrace solarization because, in the words of one of our respondents, it saves them money as well. It is a very, very good investment, but in times of tight funding, it's very, very important to set up more financially sustainable structures. Tash, of course, has mentioned some very sophisticated ones. Some of the ones that are already being utilized, you might be familiar with it, of course, are revolving funds. UNHCR has set up a green finance funds facility. I think they actually won a prize for it recently. NRC also has capital funds in place where basically savings from solarization are reinvested, generating then more monies for more solarization. This can be really, really important for field offices that otherwise will really struggle to access finance, also because of the risks involved, as Tash has mentioned. And then, of course, there are, let's say, I would call them even more sophisticated, or maybe even more, let's say, financially sustainable ways that can be complex to set up, like the internal carbon tax. It does exist. I think a well-known example is the World Food Program. They have an internal carbon tax, and I think light-duty vehicles and also flights, and that gets reinvested into an energy efficiency program that then, among others, finances solarization. I think they've solarized more than 20 offices, so it's quite successful. So these types of setups are really, really important to support field offices in solarization. And then, of course, there's also the power purchasing agreements where you purchase the energy, not the upfront, not the equipment. That is important. It is true that it can be that the risks involved for the solarizing company can be important, but it is more and more being used. Again, the IOM example I mentioned earlier I'm actually not sure if they use it, but they certainly do recommend it. So they have looked into it. And I think IRC in Nigeria are also looking into it, because if they don't use power purchasing, they would have to account for, I think, over $1 million US in upfront finances. It's very, very hard to fund. So all of these need to be looked into much more. Despite the challenges, I think there's no way around it given the increasing budget cuts. But we do have successful examples out there. So if you're keen to know more about these examples, or you're keen to get in touch with us, I will put the email address in the chat. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nora, for walking us through some of the great work underway, and the benefits, of course, of solarization. I think we're very clear. So I'm going to pass the mic over to our next speaker, who's Linda Wamun, who works for Energy Peace Partners. And she's going to walk us through a bit of their work, which you would have got a little bit of a teaser from Tash, but it's always nice to hear, as you know, the PAF facility was part of the research that Tash walked us through. But it's always nice to hear straight from the source in terms of some of the work that Energy Peace Partners has underway to this sort of overarching theme of clean energy investment and how to better resource the sector to move towards more clean energy investment. So I'm going to pass the mic over to you, Linda.
Thank you. If you can move to the second slide, please. And I think I'm going to have to modify my presentation a bit, because Tash has already covered most of what we do, and I do not wish to repeat myself. But rather, I'll provide, a little bit of background, where we started from and how we see things progressing with the PREC instrument. Just about general knowledge about Energy Peace Partners. We are a nonprofit, and we've ended up playing multiple roles. When we started off, we mostly wanted to extend the IREC architecture in these countries where the countries where we mostly focus our work on, and these are fragile and conflict-affected states. But over time, we found that we are increasingly playing a market facilitation role. And what I mean by that is along, the whole value chain, looking at the generation, issuance of the PRECs, getting government regulation in place, we are ending up playing all those different roles at different times, because we are operating in a market that hasn't previously existed, and are virtually building it down from scratch. And we have to engage multiple stakeholders, be it energy regulators, government officials, the ITRAC Standard Foundation itself, that is the standards governing body, developers on the one hand, trying to, coordinate and facilitate purchase agreements with buyers. And so over time, we see our role as having evolved, and that's where we are now. Next slide, please. In terms of where we see things, looking at on a global scale, less than half the continent is currently electrified, and some of the countries that are left behind are the ones that are the most vulnerable to conflict and climate change. Yet they don't see any of this global climate finance that flows around, and yet their populations are the ones that suffer the most. They are seen as very risky, and on a typical investment, if somebody is assessing any investment, they are often the last countries to be looked at, and they're considered very risky, and therefore, no one would want to put their money in such a country. And yet we see that on the corporate side, there is increasing interest, especially from corporates that are moving beyond just decarbonization, but they sort of want to support what they call impact. They want to extend their sustainability goals to cover countries that are suffering the most, sort of more on an equity and climate justice, meeting those kinds of goals. And so demand is growing. However, the limited mechanisms of being able to support projects in these countries is what really prompted us to develop the Peace Renewable Energy Credit as an innovative way of extending these financing mechanisms that corporates are looking towards into fragile states. Next slide, please. So about PREX, Tash already talked extensively about PREX and the PREX aggregation facility. I just want to take us a step back for those of us that may not really know what exactly PREX is. When it comes to carbon accounting, many corporates use different instruments to meet their accounting goals, and renewable energy certificates are one type of instrument that are used when corporates are accounting for their energy consumption. And this is indirect energy consumption from the electricity that they consume. And as an energy attribute type of certificate, it is globally recognized. Africa having no previous architecture, if you look at, like Europe already has the guarantees of origin, some of which are in compliance schemes. Africa and some of the other emerging markets lack any kind of framework or architecture that can support issuance of such kinds of certificates. And so that's one of the reasons why, as EPP, we have moved in to fill that gap and create this new market that exists to support developers with a new type of financing that can, get them some additional money. A PREC is basically one IREC, and we use the iTrack Standard Foundation, and we label it. We have the peace label, and the main reason we do that is to be able to draw attention to the countries that we are focusing on. A PREC is issued from specific geographies, so it's not all countries in Africa. We work in slightly over a dozen countries. And the whole idea is to be able to showcase that, this certificate is not coming from any type of installation. It's not a commercial and industrial facility or, a company somewhere that is just looking to add on solar, but rather communities that are getting access to fast-time electricity, getting electrified, and so, helping to bridge that gap. That's the whole idea behind the peace label, to draw attention to the socioeconomic benefits that are derived from extending electricity to these underserved areas. One PREC represents 1 megawatt hour of electricity generated. And by virtue of that unit of measure, this means that by default, we tend to focus on larger installations, mini grids and above, and mostly because, looking at the 1 megawatt hour of generation, if we were to look at very tiny, like solar home systems kind of units, then you would need thousands and thousands. And the current global framework, or even the standard itself, is heavily skewed towards, larger systems. They're easier to monitor, less admin work. And so that is why we default to, mini grids kind of installations and above for issuance of the PREC. We currently issue across 7 countries listed here. Recently we became an issuer in Burundi and Sierra Leone as well. We have other countries in Africa that are also issuers, but being served by another issuer. And so looking at where we are now and where Africa was 5 years ago, there has been massive progress because of, the architecture is now there. What remains is now the issuance or identifying projects that qualify and being able to extend this financing instrument to these locations. Next slide, please. In terms of the benefits, what we have done is the initial goal was to have something like the PREC aggregation facility in place. However, we knew it would take time, a very long time, as it has. And in the meantime, what we have been doing is sort of building or laying the foundation blocks of what we need to grow this sector. The first one was, speaking with buyers, getting potential buyers on board, and we have seen transactions from a number of, especially tech companies, have been very supportive, and we're increasingly seeing interest from other entertainment, consumer goods companies that are interested, that have operations in Africa but have had no way of being able to purchase certificates to make credible claims that they're using clean energy, because practically it may not be possible for them to install these systems at their premises, and because they're buying electricity from grids, and that's why they tend to and opt to purchase certificates. Developers are accessing additional financing, and the ultimate beneficiaries, I always say, is the local communities, because then they are able to access cheaper electricity for the first time, improve their economics, and especially in the countries where we work, we have seen that issues to do with security contexts, often electricity helps to extend positive benefits, because then there's one less reason for conflict when people have access to electricity, which can help them improve their livelihoods and economics through different business activities. Next slide, please. And so I'll not repeat this slide. It was extensively talked about. Tash talked about the PIREC aggregation facility. I just want to share a few updates. It is now very, very, we'll be launching very soon. Fundraising is complete. And now, we're just at the tail end of making the public announcement. So watch out, coming soon. Anyone that has potential projects or is interested in accessing or having their projects included as part of the pipeline for PAF, please feel free to reach out to EPP anytime, and we can start the qualification process. My contacts are in the last slide for anyone that's interested in reaching out. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Linda, for walking us through the work that Energy Peace Partners has had underway. And of course, Grand Challenges Canada has been really proud to support from the early days the work of Energy Peace Partners. Yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you also. Yeah.
Maybe what we'll do is we'll move into the panel discussion now, and I'll also offer to those in the room, if you have any questions throughout, feel free to just go to the mic and raise your hand, whatever. Give me a bat signal so I know you have a question. I want to keep it as interactive as possible. So don't feel like you were waiting for a moment of silence, or don't feel like that you're interrupting. Feel free to just kind of give me a signal. So if I could get Tash and Mark to come on screen, that would be great. Our lovely panelists over here, and maybe I'll just do a quick round of intros. I'll be moderating the discussion, and we've got today's Pankratov from Innovation Norway, our colleagues there at Innovation Norway, as well as Amy Jenks from Global Platform for Action for Sustainable Development, Tash Peros, who you heard from earlier, and also on the screen you have Mike Pera from UNICEF Office of Innovation, who leads their humanitarian innovation portfolio. So thanks for joining, everyone, and let's see how this hybrid panel goes. I'm thrilled that so far the tech has been working in our favor, so I think we're doing a good job. Let's get started, and maybe I'll just start with like a quick energizer, and for those of you in the room, feel free to throw out a word as well. I want each speaker literally 5 seconds, like this is a rapid fire. I want you to give me one word to describe the biggest bottleneck to scaling innovative humanitarian energy solutions. Rapid fire, what word comes to mind?
All right, I'll be a bit controversial and say grants would be my one word.
A good one?
I'm going to say procurement, because it's something we can change. It affects the quality of the solutions that we buy, and it also affects the business model that we employ.
Who's next? Mark, Tash? One word.
Yeah, limited awareness.
What was that?
Limited awareness of these financial instruments.
Limited awareness. Good one.
finance, but also evidence, since other people have covered finance.
Finance and evidence. Anyone got any others in the room to add? Shout it out.
CapEx and OpEx.
CapEx. Okay, thanks everyone. And now another sort of rapid fire. Share the name of one innovative humanitarian energy solution you are really excited about. It doesn't have to be anything you've heard about today. This is not a plug-in, but throw it out there. What comes to mind?
From my side, I'm very curious about battery swapping business models, and we can speak more about on the panel.
Ooh.
It's a cool one. I'm going to say ecosystem innovation because I think where we need an innovation now is not in the technology, but in the way that we collaborate and put various solutions together.
Second.
I'm going to say aggregator funds.
Ooh, controversial.
And yeah, and I will say how to identify simpler instruments. Simpler financial instruments. That
Awesome.
Can.
Awesome. Thank you. Anything in the room? Anything you're really excited about? An innovation you've heard about? Something you heard about today or outside of this conversation? Shout it out at me if it comes to mind. So while you're thinking about that, I'm gonna switch gears into a question. I'm gonna invite today's actually. Innovation Norway has been commissioning some important work in the clean energy space, investment space, and did a bit of a deep dive into the failure points of clean energy investment in humanitarian settings, which I think was a really interesting paper. Today's maybe take I'd say 5 minutes or so. What were some of the key takeaways of this paper?
Sure, thank you. And also thank you for the collaboration on this. We often hear from organizations that donors need to collaborate more, and this has been a great collaboration where we've taken some knowledge and built on it and moving forwards. I think in the discussion already, we've pointed out some of the failures, right? Some of the issues where we're struggling. We know a lot. We know a lot about the technology that's needed that functions in these settings. We know a lot about new business models, potential and innovative financing, and so on. And yet progress is way too slow. When we look at the numbers that describe the need, they're huge. And one thing is greening the humanitarian sort of facilities, but another is the potential in giving access to people affected by crisis. If we look at how we're spending humanitarian funding today, in 2026, an estimated 96% of humanitarian funding will go to protected situations. And if we go 10 years back in time, the number was 54%. There's been a huge change in where our funding is going and what kind of activities our funding is spent towards. And if we can change the energy component of that, we can really alleviate pressure on donor financing, we can build resilience, and we can change that picture. But we need to figure out why progress is so slow. And to figure out why progress is slow, we need to figure out what fails. So Innovation Norway, we want to be a donor that takes innovation seriously. And if you take innovation seriously, it means that you're open to failure. So we do invest in projects that potentially could fail. And we believe that is value for money. If we take the learnings, the knowledge that's developed out of those projects and build on it moving forwards. Yet when we looked at the applications that we received to our annual call for proposals, we see that they don't necessarily build on knowledge already existing in this field. So what can we do about that? Now we've talked a lot about the various failures, and Tash and her colleagues that wrote the report for us, they categorized them in it was 25 failure factors that could be grouped into 5 different categories. So you have technological failures, and that's if we buy products of poor quality or we buy products without thinking about how they will be maintained moving forwards, for example. We have a category of economic failures where we look at the short-term funding, for example, that we've known been a challenge for years now, and that often favor less efficient solutions. We have social failures. So if we, for example, introduce new cooking solutions to a community, it takes quite a while to change how we do prepare our food, right? It's culturally ingrained how we do that, and it's not a quick fix. It's about implementation, which came through when we spoke to practitioners as the sort of key challenge, a key point of failure is the implementation part. And I really recognize that when we speak to our innovators ahead of an innovation project and we ask them, what do you think is going to be the most difficult in this innovation project? They always talk about the technology, about developing something new. Yet 2 years in, when we ask them the same question, they always talk about implementation and how this new solution is pushing on systems that are really hard to change. So we need to look at that more systematically. They talked about coordination, and we saw some really stark examples of that. In a refugee camp, 3 similar technical solutions were being piloted by 3 different NGOs at the same time without coordinating. Or in another camp, you had 6 projects on lighting streets going on at the same time, not being coordinated in what kind of solutions that they procure, nor coordinating how these solutions are going to be maintained and repaired moving forwards. And though we could see from the example projects that lessons learned were being generated locally from this and changes were being made, some of these mistakes shouldn't have been made in the first place. And when they are made, it's really important that these lessons learned are shared globally so that we can build on them moving forwards globally. And then the 5th category was governance, so policy barriers towards access to energy or technology being stuck in customs for a really long time, really complicated procurement procedures that just prolong and slow down the start of projects. So these were some of the categories that came through. And then the question is, how do we build on this? How do we systematize this? And one of the proposals that came out of this project was to establish a platform that could help us aggregate this knowledge and help people easily access this knowledge so that we could build on it moving forwards. And Tash and her team proposed the abbreviation HELP for Humanitarian Energy Learning Platform. And normally I would be hesitant at sort of being excited about a platform because we have a lot of platforms and it's hard to create a platform where that is actually visible for people, that's on top of mind when people are, planning and making changes and making decisions. However, I think at this point in time, we have two sort of significant entities that will make a platform make sense. And one is that we have the GPA, and the GPA is set up to coordinate and help the system. So we already have the administrative sort of facility in place that could manage such a platform. And the other thing is AI. So before we would have, loads and reports in our drawers. We would read them once, find them exciting, and then remember some and forget the rest. But now we have this tool that can help us really pull up all this knowledge very quickly and easily. Last week, I was introduced, for example, to Save the Children's new platform where they feed in all the outcomes of their pilots. And then the platform helps them evaluate whether this is a pilot that should be scaled or whether this is a project that should be investable. And developing this platform has not been complicated because where we are with AI now. So I could foresee that we could do something similar with all the knowledge that we have in renewable energy and humanitarian energy at this point in time to help practitioners moving forwards invest in energy in a sustainable way that builds on failure and learnings.
Fantastic. Thanks, Therese. And I really commend Innovation Norway for embracing failure in a way that you're sharing this knowledge and not as a bad word. I think there's often this reluctance to share points of failure or to be open about what didn't go so well. And so I really commend Innovation Norway for really embracing this with a lens of learning, because I think that's so important in the humanitarian innovation space in particular. If we don't talk about what didn't work, then how will we learn? So well done. I'm going to move over to Mark, who's on the screen. And Mark, I know clean energy investment has been an important theme for UNICEF Office of Innovation. And maybe you could take a couple of minutes to tell us about the work you have been doing in this space and how emerging market insights have been shaping how you think about clean energy transition in humanitarian settings. So over to you, Mark.
Yeah, wonderful. Oh, thanks so much. And I really wish I was there in the room, but unfortunately had some travel. I was caught in some travel. Barriers. But yeah, in any case, happy to be here. So I think I'd like to shift the discussion slightly. So a lot of great work, a lot of great insights already, and something that UNICEF really aligns with in terms of looking at innovative finance instruments. So I think we've heard a lot from the supply side of this. If we think about it from supply and demand. So I'd like to move it over to the demand side. So essentially, we work with our country offices to help set it up, ensuring supply of energy, and to support the process for generating energy certificates. So what do we do to help facilitate that demand? And so what we did was to put together kind of a key insights and to combine these key insights based on our experience thus far. Essentially, it's around how do we identify a buyer that will be interested and willing to engage in this space. And what we found was that among entities that are interested in financial instruments, there was a low awareness that related to, for example, PREX or IREX. What they were saying was that if buyers have potentially various instruments to choose from that they need to invest in, or they have the opportunity to invest in, their awareness for the justification to pay an additional premium price for example, PREX, it was not necessarily clear. So essentially, from the buyer's perspective, they would still be getting one REC. But then the question is, okay, why would they pay a premium price for still getting that one REC? And so the value proposition and that we've been learning, especially when we're talking about failures or pivots, is really around how do we ensure that the social benefit, the premiums that relate to social dividends and peace dividends are really up in front in these kinds of discussions. So it means that I think as a sector, we really need to look at how we have a kind of a common unifying voice that relates to the value of social impact beyond the environmental attributes that companies would be paying for in order to claim those credits. So this also means that from the buyer's perspective, what we learned was that what we're discussing now, it is a volunteer market. That means that if a buyer is considering engaging in the space, there might be two kind of pathways. One would be around social corporate responsibility, and then the other pathway would be around ensuring their climate commitments in relation to regulations and policies. But because of the volunteer market that this is part of, what we're seeing is that there's that kind of that alignment with CSR principles. So because if it's voluntary, then it doesn't necessarily have the same kind of market demand that we might be seeing from other financial instruments. So we did see this as a challenge, but then also an opportunity for being able to consider how to put more emphasis on the social benefit position, or the social benefits. And then I'd just like to say that there was another challenge that related to just geographies. So we have there's a global REC market, but then at the end of the day, there might be Pakistan or Chad or other countries that are interested in generating RECs. But then how do you really identify a buyer that then will support those specific markets? Also acknowledging that these discussions, we cannot have cross-border energy certificates. So ultimately, then there are discussions that relate to, what is the buyer's incentive to engage in specific markets compared to others. And because we're working in humanitarian, we also know how complex fragile humanitarian markets are, especially considering, if it's emergency market, we don't necessarily know what tomorrow will bring. So from the buyer side, we also saw that was kind of a question that they were more interested in understanding. How do we de-risk? How do buyers also de-risk or have more confidence in the investments that they make, that those investments will still exist in those fragile contexts. So I'm proposing it as a kind of to be forthcoming, but then also using it as opportunity for teams in the room, teams online, to really see how we can come together to kind of respond to those kind of insights together. So yeah, thanks so much, Lena. Back over to
Thanks
you.
for that, Mark. I think we've got a question from Linda. Over to you, Linda.
Thanks. Not so much a question, but just something to add on to what Mark has said about, the current market rules that are also contributing to the slow growth of energy attribute certificate markets, REC markets. One of them being what is called market boundaries. And because many corporates rely on the greenhouse gas protocol standard to report emissions, it has really affected the uptake and demand growth of the REC market in Africa. And fortunately, we got a chance to sit in the working group, which has been reviewing the current standards. They are currently working on updated standards, reporting standards for organizations. I sit in the technical working group, and one of the proposals that we made is on the issue of market boundaries is to enable in Africa recognize what are called regional power pools rather than geographic country boundaries. Because that is one disparity that has existed, where in other parts of the world, if you look at the US or even Europe is considered one market, but I don't think it's possible to export electricity from Iceland to some other countries. And so, this sort of double existing standards, where if you look at Africa or even Southeast Asia, boundaries are looked at geographically, politically, country boundaries, and yet in other locations it's not. So by recognizing regional power pools, that will not entirely solve the problem, but it's a starting point where we know electricity markets exist. If you look at East Africa, for example, the East African power pool. So Ethiopia is currently interconnected with Kenya, Uganda is. And so if somebody is looking for certificates, for example, from Uganda, they can buy in Kenya if they cannot get in Uganda. So, such small changes are what are going to drive the market forward. Like I've been repeating, we are currently operating in an environment where this, it's been non-existent on, African continent, even on a global scale. The current standards did not factor into consideration the way Africa is set up, the way Africa is electrifying. All that was not factored in, and I think it's up to us. And I would encourage anyone in the room, yes, the public consultation period is over, but that doesn't stop any organization from sending their points or notes or comments to the Secretariat of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, for example, and stating their country case and saying, this is our situation. If the current rules remain, then we'll still remain disadvantaged. So I would encourage anyone in the room, if you want to do direct outreach to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Secretariat, WRI, please go ahead and do so. The more voices we have advocating for change, ultimately the better for the whole sector. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Linda, and thanks for the plug-in on the really important work you're driving at the GHG. I think that's the right acronym. I know we all hate acronyms, but I
Yes,
already forget.
GHG.
GHG. Global. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Linda. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Amy now. The GPA has been spearheading some important initiatives to drive clean energy investment in displacement settings. So take a few minutes to tell us about some of these key initiatives and where you see opportunities for others to crowd in support of collective action. And I also want to hear about this battery swapping business model. No, battery swappings. It sounds really interesting. Over to you, Amy.
Might nerd out with that on that with you later. Yeah, also just taking a step back of where we were in this conversation 2 years ago. I remember this wonderful panel was sitting here kind of talking about the same thing. How do we scale energy solutions? And I think the conversation has really advanced. So I want to thank you all for leading that change. It's really great to see. From our side, the GPA has been building this topic, this nexus of sustainable energy in humanitarian response for the last 8 years. And I would like to talk about kind of 3 areas that we work in. One around project pipeline building, one around building supportive enabling environments, and the other around mobilizing resources. So something we've been trying to do for many years around the topic of energy access project pipeline building is what we do is kind of convene public and private sector. So we bring together the companies, the governments, the humanitarian and development organizations, the financial institutions, community representatives, and see kind of what are the energy access needs, what is the ability to pay for energy, and how can we do that from a more market driven perspective, because that has a higher chance of kind of being more sustainable in the long term than just doing grant-based things. Of course, grants are necessary to overcome that high capital cost that we've been talking about, but that needs to be done, I think, from a private sector perspective that really wants to provide a customer with an energy service that's going to last for a while. So something we've done with colleagues at Mercy Corps in Ethiopia is help them kind of develop a solar PV mini grid that is now serving over to 20,000 people in Sheder refugee camp in Ethiopia. So we kind of brought companies and donors and them together to kick that off. And that's a really key, I think, lighthouse project in this sector, where they basically developed the first Ethiopian certified mini grid company, and that is now providing power to a refugee camp. So instead of doing, solar lantern distribution on a short scale, they've actually invested in long-term infrastructure, and people are paying for that service. And actually, the consumption of energy, I think, is at 3 times the national average of energy consumption. So it shows that if you get the right company, the right investment in place, you can really do something sustainable and lasting. Another thing we've been doing on trying to develop project pipelines is really looking at this topic of power purchase agreements. So instead of a humanitarian agency buying an asset, buying a big solar system, installing it, and then paying for operations and maintenance for a while, is actually switching the business model to where a company, an energy service company, can just provide power to a humanitarian agency. So we've just actually kicked off some work with a Berlin-based energy access institute on actually building those bigger project pipelines. I've been working with colleagues at UNICEF, at IOM, at WFP to really get that pipeline in place. So I think hopefully in 1 year we have great results to show there, and can show how basically we look at a bigger scale, aggregate financing, as Tash was saying, to move towards these service-based delivery models. A second point is around enabling environments. So something we've done at the GPA a lot more at the global level has been helping humanitarian partners to set up energy strategies. I think those setting up the policy and regulatory environment, it's not very sexy work that a donor wants to fund and cut a ribbon and say we did a big project, but really that's how you build the ecosystems that Therese was talking about. So what we've been doing is really supporting humanitarian agencies to develop those energy plans and strategies. And now what we want to do next is what we will focus in a few key countries, in Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, where the kind of market or the humanitarian situation is a bit more protected and advanced, is to support these local energy master plans, where you look at what are the short-term energy needs, how can humanitarians support those investments, what are the medium-term energy needs, how can development banks support those, and what are the very long-term needs, and how can we build those local energy utilities to serve those very last-mile customers in humanitarian and displacement settings. So I think that enabling environment work is extremely important. And then kind of matching those two, the enabling environments and then the projects that need financing. It's all about mobilizing resources. So something that we've done is kind of advised and supported donors to connect with the right projects. We've, for instance, supported CEDA to connect with Practical Action in Rwanda, who's been doing a lot of local market building. And they kind of scaled up pilots that had some initial progress and now are really going to scale and actually creating that magic thing that we all want is local communities to be able to make income and not depend so much on humanitarian aid. So in the past, we've done a lot of matchmaking between resource providers and project developers. And what we want to do in the next years is see kind of how to work with partners to orchestrate that financing system even better to get to higher scale. So if anyone wants to go on that journey with us, very open invitation.
Thanks, Amy. So we've got a few minutes left. Just a shout out, if there's any questions in the room, just raise your hand and we can get to it. But I want to just give a few minutes also to Tash, who's here, just to kind of see if, your academic research has focused on energy in Africa and market development of solar technologies. And of course, you've been driving a lot of the work, research work behind Innovation Norway and our own paper. And we've covered a lot of ground, I think, today in today's conversation. But I wanted to just sense check with you, Tash. Is there anything else, perhaps that you haven't heard today, or any points you wanted to reinforce today, in terms of what really needs to shift to enable the sector to move towards closing the energy access gap in fragile settings? So maybe just take a couple of minutes to see if we've missed anything or anything you want to reinforce from your perspective.
Two very quick points. So firstly, I'd like to kind of build upon what Therese said about the importance of failure. So I really think that we need to get better at using the resources that we have to achieve results. We need to get better at standing on the shoulders of the people that have come before us and already tried things and learned a load of stuff along the way. And that really requires more coordination between donors, more openness about what has been tried and where, more honesty about what has worked and what has not worked. We would, of course, propose help as a way of doing that. And if anyone's interested in having a chat with us about it, please feel free to drop me an email or to talk to Amy, who is there in Geneva at the moment. And then my second point is about evidence. So having been in a few workshops with finance people, there's often a call for more evidence about what works and why. And I find this kind of ironic because there are lots of people generating evidence all the time. There are communities of academics who are working on these things, but I think there's a real lack of integration between the academic community and the practitioner world. And I really think that everybody would benefit if we tried to bridge that gap. So we need more, I would say, academics doing good research that's unafraid to be critical, but tries to be constructive, we don't want to take anything down. And another really important point is that of communicating it in ways that are useful to donors, governments, and private sector. So, for example, with this project with Grand Challenges Canada that I've just been doing, the output that was requested was an academic journal article. The problem is that will take a year to publish, and therefore we are also writing a brief so that we can kind of get it out there sooner before it becomes out of date. Thank you.
Thanks, Tash. Appreciate you highlighting the importance of evidence so we've covered a lot of ground today. If there's any questions, just last call for our speakers. But before we wrap up, as I know the break is upon us, and others have other places to get to in the venue, I want to thank our speakers online and offline, here in person, for joining us today and sharing your insights and sharing some of the research findings that have been coming out of various work being done. I think this is if I can borrow from today, this is a really good example of donor coordination, practitioner coordination, and I think we need to see more of this across the sector, working with researchers like Tash and team, and working with others who are also investing in this space for the benefit of the humanitarian sector and improving lives in these settings. And so I want to thank you all for joining today and contributing to this really productive collaboration. And let's see what we come up with next year. So for those of you online, thanks for joining us and for engaging in the discussion.